Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Brianne Roth. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Nantucket Historical Association, and I want to welcome you all here to our first Food for Thought for the fall series. So welcome. Before we get started, if everyone could please check your cell phones, make sure they're on silent so we do not disrupt today's lecture. As always, we want to thank you for joining us, and we would like to recognize that the Food for Thought program series is made possible in part by the MS Worthington Foundation, and that media sponsorship is generously provided by Novation Media. And I would like to take a moment just to give a special thanks and acknowledgement. This past spring, we marked the 10th anniversary of our Food for Thought series by dedicating this community program to David Worth Sr. David passed away in June 2016. We will miss him and his presence in the Great Hall, and we will remember his unwavering support and near-perfect attendance of this series. David, we hope to make you proud as the series continues. Today, we are delighted to feature Geoffrey Kovach, a historian who teaches at Charter Oak State College and Gateway Community College. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2015 and was the NHA's 2016 Verney Fellow, and we would like to thank the Verneys for making this fellowship possible and having him join us here today for this lecture. He lives with his wife Jill and son Hunter in Colchester, Connecticut. Please give a round of applause for Geoffrey Kovach.
Thank you, Brianne, for that introduction. I'd also be remiss if I did not thank each and every one of you for showing up, as well as the Verneys for the fellowship. Geoffrey and Elizabeth Thayer Verney have been supporting the NHA for close to 20 years or so in regards to this fellowship, and for that they're to be very warmly thanked, as well as the staff of the NHA as a whole, especially the library. The research library has been helping me for the past 12 years since I began my doctoral studies in 2004, and I could not have done it without their patient assistance. So thank you to them, certainly. This presentation is going to look at a part of Nantucket history that is sometimes overshadowed a bit, and that's in part because when you have works that come out, like Nathaniel Philbrick's wonderful In the Heart of the Sea, you see the island and its role in whaling. What you don't necessarily see is what was happening on the island at home. And that is what this presentation is going to look at, specifically with the Quaker meeting, in particular the Quaker Women's Business meeting, which met once a month. Let me get started. There we go. In the 19th century, a series of reformers, including Sisters Lucretia Mott and Martha Coffin Wright, who were fundamental at the Seneca Falls Convention, as well as Anna Gardner, the abolitionist, Phoebe Hannaford, the minister, Maria Mitchell, all could trace their roots back to the 18th century Quaker meeting on Nantucket, especially the role of the women's meeting, which emerged in 1708 when the meeting itself was founded. How is it that both the Religious Society of Friends as a whole, and in particular Nantucket, play such a key role in those 19th century reforms? It's my argument that this extends to the 18th century role that the women's meeting played, in particular in serving as a source of public authority and education, most especially in regards to marriage and marriage regulation. There is a sense of public leadership within Nantucket that emerges in the early 18th century. This extends all the way to the beginning of the women's meeting, which was founded, by the way, without permission of the yearly meeting yet. That's how cutting edge the women's meeting was. It's also important that the conversion of Nantucket among its English population on the island extends to who many see as the Quaker matriarch of the island, Mary Coffin Starbuck. She's often referred to as Great Mary, and it was her conversion in 1701, 1702. The years differ depending on which scholar is speaking to this. Her conversion really led to the foundation of Quakerism on the island. Other Quaker women on Nantucket would end up following suit, providing a level of spiritual authority and public authority on matters including religion and the family, charity, and education. So the Quaker system of marriage on the island was absolutely central because the family was such a central part to Nantucket as a whole. And that extended from both the educational and financial support that the meeting had received from the whaling empire, but also the extent to which marriage was a foundation for education, for future vocational skills. A harmonious family structure would lead to what was known as holy conversation. Now, holy conversation was a common term within Quaker society. It generally spoke to the way the family would speak in terms of peace, in terms of harmony within the home. Holy conversation was a very domestic idea. And as such, holy conversation would prepare girls in terms of speaking within the meeting, as well as literacy and numeracy, which would become enormously important with the record keeping and the economic role that the women would play on the island in the 18th century. And in many cases, boys would find the Quaker meeting and family connections as their own road to their economic futures, serving in apprenticeships, on whaling ships, and what have you. So with this in mind, marriage is central to what is going on Nantucket. It is perhaps the cornerstone of Quaker society on the island. Couples that would seek to marry would first have to speak to their parents. And as long as parents were living, parental consent was an absolute necessity when it came to couples that wished to marry. So once they had the support of their parents, they would go to the elders of the meeting, speak to them, so that any possible resolutions or any possible situations that could serve as obstacles for the marriage would be cleared up before the couple actually went to present themselves to the meeting. It did not always work this way, but that was generally the idea. If both sets of parents and the elders of the meeting agreed that this was a match that would provide a family unit that would add to the holy conversation taking place on Nantucket, they would give that approval. And then it was up to both business meetings. And when I say both business meetings, in addition to worship meetings on the island, both men and women met monthly for the purpose of conducting business. This was aside from joint worship meetings. And those meetings were to tend to everything from collections and charitable contributions to the marriage process, any level of disownments, any level of transgression, any sort of behavior that had to go before the meeting. That would be handled within the business meeting so that it was not handled during the worship. So a couple would present themselves to both the men's and women's meetings. And at that point, the meetings, both men and women, would appoint committees that would meet with the bride and groom. The women's meeting would appoint a committee, usually of 2 female friends, who would meet with the bride. And the men's meeting would appoint a couple, generally 2, some instances 3, male friends who would meet with the groom. And normally they would check for something known as clearness. Clearness generally meant that the person who was trying to marry was not previously married, or if they had been previously married, that the marriage had ended as a result of as someone being deceased. In general, that this was especially true on Nantucket because you had such a high level of mortality based on the whaling industry. If both meetings, investigators came back to the couple and to the meeting and said you were clear to marry, they would give their approval. The couple would have to declare their intent a second time. With that approval from both men's and women's meetings, the couple would be allowed to proceed and marry. As soon as those bureaucratic ties were out of the way and they had been cleared, the couple, once they had the permission of the meeting to marry, would usually marry either in meeting or in the house of a friend. And it had to be specifically under certain Quaker ceremonies that they would marry. If there was a minister or priest involved, that could be grounds for dismissal, and in some instances it was grounds for dismissal. This would generally come in the form of disownment. But if it was done in a truly Quaker fashion, both parties would read a prepared statement, and generally these were pretty similar. They did not differ much based on gender. The elders and the others, the visitors at the meeting who were attending the wedding, would speak to the couple on behalf of what they were going into. And once the ceremony was completed, all of the visitors would sign a certificate, and that would be the formal acceptance of the meeting that the couple were now married within the eyes of the meeting, and that they were accepted into the community as a family. So how important was this? If we look just at the first half century from the founding of the meeting in 1708, we see where marriage petitions to the women's meeting will escalate over that first half century. It becomes a vastly increasing part of the meeting's responsibility that they are handling marriage and marriage regulation. From fewer than 20 in its first decade, we can see the decade between 1748 and 1757, we see about 120, just under 120, which would be one meeting a month for that 10-year period. That would be one marriage per month at the meeting. So marriage is becoming an increasingly important part of Quaker society and an important function of the women's meeting. As that is happening, there's a level of family leadership arising on Nantucket. Nantucket became Quaker in part because of the efforts of Newport Quakers to establish a sister Quaker colony. And they had sent over estimates of more than 100 visitors in the decade that led to the founding of the monthly meeting. So the Rhode Island, which was the home of the Rhode Island meeting, as well as the New England yearly meeting, which was the governing body for Quakerism, they would send over visitors to try to convert the island. One visitor in particular, John Richardson, is the person who convinces Mary Coffin Starbuck to convert to Quakerism. And he also is the one who establishes her nickname of Great Mary. And this is important because she becomes not just one of the founding members of the meeting, but it's her family that is going to play a huge role in the meeting's rise over the first half of the 18th century. Her son will serve in several offices, Nathaniel Starbuck Jr. He will serve in several offices within the meeting. So the women's meeting becomes a source of a public voice for what otherwise had been private. This is sort of something that is described at times as the world turning inside out, where the private becomes increasingly public. Friends would not only take collections for fellow friends in need. There's one instance of a woman by the name of Eunice Gwynn who is going to receive the charity of the meeting on a few occasions, and then she's later disowned for one of the violations and transgressions we'll talk about later, exogamy. But as male absences became more common, and this is especially true in a whaling community like Nantucket in the 18th century, as whaling voyages become longer, the advent of try-works on whaling ships, trips that had extended from a few months suddenly become 2- and 3-year trips. Those extended absences place a much greater level of authority and autonomy on women within the family structure and within the religious community. And this is going to be a foundation for what will come. Women on the island become essentially public actors. They are charged with preserving the morality of the island in the absence of men. And because so much discipline would fall on the women's meeting to enforce, they are going to see their role within the meeting greatly expand. Nevertheless, there is a period of change, and that change is going to come in about the 1760s. If anyone here is familiar with Jack Marietta and the work that he did regarding Delaware Valley Quakers, he wrote a book on the Reformation of American Quakerism, 1748 to 1784. In that book, he looks at reform movements that emerged out of the Delaware Valley. Well, New England, and in particular Nantucket, were not immune to these reform movements. These reform movements brought about a greater piety within the meeting, but also more strict enforcement of regulations, particularly when looking at marriage. And this is something that we will see. Over the course of the 1760s and 1770s, the women's meeting becomes much more active in terms of its enforcement of marital regulations. We are going to look first at a disownment of a woman by the name of Keziah Coffin. Some of you may be familiar with her story. She's one of the most outspoken women on the island in the 18th century. In particular, when the revolution comes around, she's an outspoken loyalist. But before that, she falls into a bit of a difficult situation with the meeting. And unlike most of the other female friends that we're going to discuss who receive discipline, disownments, and what have you from the women's meeting in the 18th century, she will be disowned because she takes a spinet, a musical instrument, and has it in her home for her daughter to play. Ironically, if you think about that in the context of property and female ownership of property, in general, under laws of coverture, all property within the home would be the responsibility of the man. Her husband's not disowned, but she is. So the meeting clearly sees that she is responsible for this spinet that's in their home. And that's interesting because it does place the meeting as seeing her as at least an equal partner within the home, as opposed to simply being on a secondary status from a legal perspective. Her story ends up becoming the foundation for a novel that comes out a good 16 years before Melville writes Moby Dick. Joseph Hart writes Miriam Coffin or The Whale Fisherman. And that Miriam Coffin is very strongly based on this outspoken Keziah Coffin. So during the 18th century, as this is happening, as the meeting is taking on more and more responsibility, we are seeing women becoming much more vocal. And that voice is coming out in particular regarding both the meeting and in economic circles. I'm fortunate that with the Verney Fellowship, I've been able to work on one of two chapters I'm hoping to add to my defended dissertation before working into a book manuscript, and that is dealing with the economics of the women's meeting. And this is a part of the story that is often not told in the 18th century. In the 19th century, there's a good bit of discussion about Petticoat Row, about the role of women in terms of business, but that does extend to the late 18th century, where we see women who are acting on behalf of the family, something that Laurel Ulrich referred to as deputy husbandry. That women are, because out of necessity, because men are absent for 2-3 years at a time, women are managing the family economy. So over the course of the 18th century, especially into the second half, we see an island that is much more controlled by women on several levels: religious, social, even economic. At the same time, we do see women who are rebelling against the system. Female empowerment came through the meeting, but also at sometimes in economic circles and in opposition to the meeting. We're going to see a couple cases where women are speaking out against the dictates of the meeting, basically saying, we'd rather be disowned than have to face the public acknowledgement that the meeting wants us to give. And now for regulating marriage. I will apologize at first because this is a part that is, this is something that my dissertation advisor had referred to at one point and had warned me against it going too much in the direction of Jerry Springer history. So I take that with a certain seriousness of that. That said, with the tone of the current presidential election, I'm not sure that we could say anything too shocking in this presentation. So regulation of marriage is a particularly important role of the women's meeting. And the women's meeting would regulate its members against fornication. Now, when I say fornication, this generally is referring to premarital as opposed to extramarital regulations. Marrying without parental consent, exogamy, marrying outside of friends, in other words, marrying a non-Quaker. When I refer to incest, in general, this is consensual marriage between cousins, which is something that the Quaker meeting is actually going to crack down on considerably more than even Puritans did. Quakers took it a stricter role in enforcing marriage between cousins and ensuring that partners were not too close in relation, as well as bigamy. There aren't too many cases of bigamy, but the main one that leads to the first disownment on the island will involve a school teacher who becomes a pirate, and we'll get to that. Each of these offenses endangered the family unit and endangered that sense of holy conversation which is supposed to take place within the family. Now, when the women's meeting would punish, and I use the term punish, it's not really necessarily a punishment for punishment's sake, but rather a corrective measure. It could go from anything from a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing all the way to disownment. In other words, you're out of the community. And the meeting would regulate this from its inception. As I mentioned, we will, within the first decade, see our first disownment. Actually, within the first 5 years, we'll see our first disownment. But regulation of marriage becomes increasingly strict, starting in the 1760s and the 1770s, with that reform movement that that I previously discussed that had arisen in the Delaware Valley and had spread its way to New England. So first is the sin of fornication. In this case, we're looking at premarital relations as opposed to extramarital. The language used on fornication is in particular interesting because we will see over time it becomes much more blunt. In the early period, couples that had been accused of engaging in premarital relations would have their transgressions mentioned in the meeting minutes as someone is concerned with. And that led to increasing language to the extent where the meeting would sometimes refer to those who had engaged in this as committing that awful sin in the eyes of God. But by the 1770s, it is much more blunt. And the meeting records will specify that someone is being disowned or punished, or they're offering a public acknowledgement for fornication. Now, couples that had married were expected to produce children. That was a part of the expectation. That was all within the context of holy conversation. But before marriage, any relations before marriage was seen as a significant threat to the family structure, to harmony, to the meeting. I want to first look at a case in the end of the 18th century, 1793. Lydia Hussey is interested in this man named Laban Barnard. And they have relations shortly before he goes off to sea. While he's at sea, she gives birth to a child. She becomes pregnant, gives birth to a child. Unfortunately, the child did not survive, but it's pretty obvious from what had happened that she had had relations before marriage. She receives the discipline of the women's meeting, where they go to her, they send an investigative committee to her, they talk to her about what had happened. She admits her transgression. When she arrives, or when she presents herself before the meeting, she had already spoken with Dorcas Brown and Sarah Barker, and they had convinced her to acknowledge what was quite obvious. However, for Laban Barnard, it was his return from the sea where he first finds out about this. He refuses to acknowledge to the men's meeting what he had done. He gets disowned. Yet the couple still marry, and they go on and have a long, extensive married life. But that's the extent to which the meeting was willing to forgive, especially the women's meeting, if one would own up to a transgression. If you acknowledge a transgression, in general, you would not face disownment. 20 years before that, 1773, Margaret Gardner Swain would find herself disowned for two particular sins, or transgressions, as it were. One is having a child too soon after marriage, which falls under the category of fornication. The other was exogamy, that she had gone out from the good order of friends to marry. In other words, she married someone who was not a Quaker. 2 years after her, Anna Folger Gardner is faced with similar discipline from the meeting because of her transgressions. She actually informs the meeting that she would rather be disowned than accept their discipline. This is kind of a very important step in the meeting because this suggests that the meeting does not have the full authority to where members feel like they must belong to it. If Anna Gardner, and this is not to be confused with the Anna Gardner of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, this Anna Gardner is saying that she would rather not acknowledge wrongdoing and not face a public acknowledgement within the meeting. She'd rather face disownment. And the women's meeting grants her her wish. What's very important about this is that she was the great-granddaughter of Great Mary, of Mary Coffin Starbuck. As such, she was a part of this long-standing matriarchy of leadership within the meeting, this family structure. And for her, not only to face the judgment of the meeting, but also to renounce that judgment so strongly, suggests that there is a major shift that has taken place within the women's meeting between when Mary Coffin Starbuck was a founding member and the late 18th century. So, if we look at exogamy and marrying outside of friends, we're going to see two different periods within the meeting. The first is a period before 1772-73. And during that period, in general, women who faced the discipline of the meeting for marrying outside of friends only did so because they had gone back to the meeting and had sought a second marriage. An example would be a friend who had married outside of friends. Her first husband dies, lost at sea, something like that. And then she wants to marry someone who is within the meeting. Before she could be cleared to marry, she had to admit her previous transgression. In 1772 and 1773, the governing bodies in Newport for the monthly meetings sent out epistles that required the meetings to not just passively deal with this situation when it came up, but rather to actively seek out friends who had married outside of the community. And the result of this is, if you look at the meeting records in especially 1773 and 1774, you're going to see a slew of disownments because it's no longer just a matter of sitting back and waiting for friends to come to you. The meeting's sending out these investigating committees to all these people who the community knew had married, but who the meeting hadn't previously acted upon. So because of that proactive stance, the membership within the meeting is going to start to diminish. Only because as it is more actively seeking out friends who had married non-Quakers, they're beginning to lose membership. One instance of this extends, really there are several instances of this that extend from the 1770s and into the 1790s, because in 1791, the women's meeting, or the yearly meeting, would reinforce that stance and say that friends have to be held accountable for when they went out of friends. In other words, if any friends shall marry contrary to the good order established among us, being previously cautioned by the overseers, the monthly meeting where such belongs proceed to make a minute of denial and testify against them. In other words, they were seeking people. They were 1791, they were continuing that practice. Now, To see an example of what happened before that epistle, you can look at Ruth Bunker in 1761. Is her husband, John Myrick, who was not a Quaker, was lost at sea. She would, 4 years later, approach the meeting about marrying a friend, Shubel Barnard. But before she was given permission, she had to acknowledge her previous marriage as being exogamous, as being outside of friends. And only then could she receive the permission of the meeting to marry. So starting in 1773, we see a slew of these records that pop up of friends being disowned for exogamy. Abigail Macy is one of the first. She's going to acknowledge her transgression, as it were. In May of 1773, Phoebe Hussey chooses disownment over acknowledging her exogamous marriage. Several others would follow suit in 1773 and beyond. This is very similar to the Anna Gardner case that I had mentioned of a woman who's refusing or rejecting the authority of the meeting. So when it came to the transgression of incest, or what was often considered too near of kin in the records, this was something that happened fairly often in a community like Nantucket, just because you had such an extensive network of family. And it was some of the same families in this insular island where prospective spouses were in general going to be no further than second or third cousins. It was just the necessity of finding available spouses who were not. It was a fairly difficult task. And yet, Quakers, especially on the island, cracked down pretty hard, not only on first cousins marrying, but also in some instances on second, third cousins, what we might call first cousins once removed or second cousins once removed, according to our modern lexicon. So these restrictions were both based on blood, consanguinity, as well as on relation, affinity. And we're going to see instances of both. We're going to start with an early case, and this is 1723. This is Abigail Folger and Daniel Folger. Now, obviously, the same last name would suggest that the possibility of them having shared family was greater, but there were friends who married with the same surname who did not have that level of relation. In this case, though, her paternal grandparents were his paternal great-grandparents. So by what we would refer today, in modern language, we would refer to this as first cousins once removed. Not to mention they were linked. They were cousins, what you might call double cousins, in that they had a second cousin relationship that was a bit more extended. When they expressed their desire to marry, they were investigated, as all of the marriages had been, and that investigation led to the meeting saying, "Well, we can clear you to marry, but it's not in full unity." So there's a note within the records that suggests that they were married, but within the meeting there were those who objected to their marriage because of their relation. As it turns out, their first son was born only 6 months after the marriage, so this may have been a marriage out of necessity anyway. And now we see evidence of where affinity or relation could limit one's potential spouses. John Waterman's wife, Elizabeth Beard, gave birth to 2 children. Then she would die in 1759. Not long thereafter, Elizabeth's sister, Mary, began living with John. They had not declared their intention to marry, They had not gone before the meeting, and they knew had they done so, they would have been denied. That marrying the spouse of one's, or marrying the sibling of one's deceased spouse was considered a violation of this. Yet the couple was living essentially as a married couple without having gone through the process of marrying. They did not appear before the meeting, and when they did decide to have a wedding ceremony, they actually went through the formal process of having a Quaker-like ceremony with the certificate and visitors and everything that Quaker weddings had, even though it was totally unofficial within the eyes of the meeting. Completely unofficial, and yet they had this, they went through this process. They would find themselves disowned for their behavior, ultimately. And this would pop up again in 1791. Judith Starbuck Coffin married her deceased husband's brother, and that led to her facing disownment as well. Bigamy, or polygamy, it did not happen very often on the island. What's interesting about this is that the main instance that we have of a bigamous marriage is not a man, but a woman. And one would think that it was a man simply because an island like Nantucket, with such a maritime culture and community, would have men who might find themselves in other ports getting married. There's certainly evidence of this in non-Quaker New England communities. But in this instance, the strongest case that we have is that first disownment. It is Tabitha Trott, who in 1713 is going to be disowned because she marries a Dr. Joseph Brown. The problem with that is that her first husband, John Frost, who had been a school teacher, is going to leave the island and abandon her and their children to become a privateer. He leaves his family to become a privateer. After a couple of years, she presumes him deceased. She remarries. When John Frost appears back on the island, suddenly that is cause for her to face the discipline of the meeting because she had not sufficiently proven that he was deceased because he was still alive. Even though he had gone through and abandoned the family, she is the one held responsible for this. This is a case where, and if you read the minutes of the meeting, how they speak about her marriage, that she had in an unchristian, unlawful manner proceeded to take a man, as she saith, be her lawful husband, which unchristian action we deny, and shall not stand charged with her until unfeigned repentance. That she was the one who faced the discipline of the meeting, as opposed to him, that he had abandoned the family. That speaks volumes to how much protocol and rules mattered within the meeting, and how strict both the men's and women's meeting treated marriage violations, and how they even saw an instance like this to be counter to harmony. So for her, she ends up disowned from the meeting. She relocates with her new husband to Newport. Her mother, who was one of the original signers of the petition that established the women's meeting, is going to relinquish her position of authority within it. And this is an instance where the meeting placed so much responsibility on her and essentially on her mother because of this transgression that the fault is placed on them. And as such, with the mother facing so much shame, she's the one who leaves the meeting. Now, the last part I'm going to look at is divorce, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it because divorce is essentially non-existent within the meeting. Because the meeting did not have any mechanism for divorce, they would extend tremendous steps to try to resolve marriage difficulties. That was the main alternative to divorce. Troubled couples would have visitors arrive, and those visitors would provide everything from counseling to, if necessary, discipline. But it was a lot of attempting to find reconciliation within troubled marriages. An example we have is 1729, where even before getting married, Tabitha Folger had stated that her husband-to-be, who she declared her intent to marry, had been too forward with her before they had married. The meeting steps in, and after he acknowledges his wrongdoing, the couple end up getting married, and this is an example of the meeting stepping in. In 1795, Robert Clasby is going to leave his wife and leave his home and his wife, Eunice, and there's great tension between them. The meeting steps in to try to find a reconciliation between them, and that reconciliation is not necessarily does not necessarily come. They both find themselves disowned from the meeting as a result of it. So, why is all this important? Why is any of this important? I want to get to. Within this strict community, this strict religious community in the 18th century, we're going to see this example of public authority emerging out of the women's meeting. And that is going to have an important role on those 19th century reformers who I had mentioned. From Seneca Falls to the abolitionist movement to religious and even scientific leaders. Lucretia Mott even speaks directly to the importance of these women in the 18th century and of the Quaker meeting. She extends in a series of letters she's writing to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that she found tremendous role models within the Nantucket Quaker women's meeting of the 18th century. That those generations before her, in terms of their moral leadership, had led to her in the 19th century having that foundation and groundwork from which she became a reformer. Her sister, Martha Coffin Wright, had the same roots. And this is where this extends. The meeting is such an important part of the 18th century that by the 19th century, such matriarchal strength on the island created this culture of 19th century reformers. Thanks, and I'd like to open this up to questions if anyone has anything.
All right,
Yes.
I'll come to you real quick. I have a microphone. So.
Oh, I'm sorry, there.
So, in the real sort of day-to-day life at that point, what real impact did disownment have? I understand, but in day-to-day life, did it?
It's a very good question because disownment did not even necessarily extend to meetings of worship. If you were disowned, you could still attend meetings of worship. What it did, though, was it took you out of the context of holding any positions of power and authority within the meeting. Now, obviously, some women did not consider that at all important. When you have women who are voluntarily saying, I choose disownment over facing the discipline of the meeting, they're saying the meeting's authority, the meeting's power within the community isn't that great. For others, they were willing to acquiesce to the meeting's discipline because they saw the meeting as a true source of power. So and I don't mean to be I don't mean to sound in any way wishy-washy with this answer, but a lot of it depended on how much importance within the hierarchical structure of the meeting any particular woman would find it. If a woman wished to ascend to a position of being an elder or a visitor, then clearly being disowned was a massive obstacle. There was pretty much a complete detriment to that ever happening. But if a woman was simply married into the meeting, or not necessarily married, but born into the meeting, and it was not a vital part of how they saw themselves within the community, it might not necessarily be that important.
I have one question here, and then we'll go over.
The topic of incest. Do you think that the reason the Quakers came down very hard, harder than anybody else on this question, is because they had knowledge that this wasn't particularly healthy?
I don't know necessarily if it had any sort of medical reasoning as much as it had a religious reasoning. And what I mean by that is Puritans, for example, viewed marriage. They had taken the institution of marriage out of English common law, and they viewed it as as opposed to a sacrament necessarily, as you would see in a Quaker community or even in a Roman Catholic community in other colonies, Maryland, for example, where marriage had this very strong religious context. Marriage had more of a civil context within Puritan society. So for Puritan women, divorce, incest, cousin marriage, as it were, they could take a less strict view of that sort of thing because they did not view this as this holy institution necessarily. It was not that important to the holy conversation of the home the way it was within Quaker communities. As for when medical understandings of the obstacles met by marrying too close in relation arise, I don't know exactly when that creeps into Quaker theology necessarily, but it's certainly a good question, and it's probably something that at least into 19th century we start to see.
We've got one more question over here.
Sure.
You mentioned the effect of the reforms that were taking place in Delaware had on Nantucket. What brought about, was it the rise of competitive faiths, or what brought about the tightening of those reforms?
Are you speaking to the Delaware Valley or to New England?
Well, initially in Delaware,
Okay.
and then obviously it moved.
Okay, in the Philadelphia area, what you begin to see in the early part of the 18th century is a Quakerism that had started to morph from the very dogmatic 17th century roots. The first two generations or so of Quakers in and around Philadelphia, just as it had been in England, were extremely devout and extremely disciplined regarding their faith because they saw as, in many ways, as sort of a converse to the civil authority that was cracking down on them. Because in the Delaware Valley, you have Quakers who control the state as well as the church, we start to see a lessening, a more lenient Quakerism begin to be practiced in the early part of the 18th century. And I think by and large in the Delaware Valley, this was sort of a pendulum swing away from that. What will happen in New England is that it doesn't really start in the 1740s, but it will start in about the 1760s. That said, Nantucket is, the Nantucket monthly meeting is relatively cutting edge when it comes to questions of slavery and abolition, being one of the earliest to speak out against slavery, whereas speaking out against slavery in the Pennsylvania area, in the area of the Delaware Valley, Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey and even into Delaware, that was seen with much more resistance by friends who did not see slavery as a moral evil necessarily. There will actually be a schism within Quakerism over the question of slavery, particularly in some of those areas where slavery is more commonly found during the 18th century.
We have one last question right
Sure.
here. I saw your hand, and then we'll wrap it up.
Actually, this isn't a question, it's an invitation. I want you all to know that the Quaker Meeting House on Fair Street will be open on Sunday from 10 to 11, and we invite you to come and sit with us for an hour, either to pray or to meditate. And it's quite a wonderful experience. It's a very spiritual place. So Sunday, 10 to 11.
All right. We can open up. If you have a question, you can come up and talk to Geoffrey one-on-one. I want to thank you all for coming here today. We'll be here next week with Christine Harding and Susan Boardman with the Moby Dick Limerick. So please join us next week for Food for Thought next week.